haven't checked the weather yet, but I know it is the perfect day to chat about adult Jewish literature. I'm Cheryl Stahl. Thanks for joining me here at Nice Jewish Books. Today, I am pleased to host Janice Weizman, author of Our Little Histories. Welcome, Janice.
Hi.
So, can you please tell me about your book?
Sure. So it's a novel called Our Little Histories, and it basically starts today and in 7 long chapters follows the history of a single Jewish family going back in time. So that the first chapter starts today and it ends up in 1850 in Belarus. And in through that story, we're sort of queuing into the story of the Eastern Jewish community and what happened to it, Eastern European Jewish community, and what happened to it over the last 150 years.
So there are a few things that tie everything together. One is that the people are related, it's a family, although in the present day we're at maybe fourth or fifth cousins.
That's right.
And I appreciate that you put a family tree in the front of the book to keep track of everyone.
Yeah, it gets to be a lot of people.
And there's also a mysterious poem that has mostly lost its meaning at the beginning of the book in the current day, but we find out as we go backward in time where it was from and what it meant. And so we can kind of talk about it in each of the sections.
Yeah.
So the first chapter, you said, starts contemporary times in
Chicago.
So it's an American Jennifer, who has been invited to Belarus, and she is a museum curator known for putting on living exhibits.
Yeah, living installations.
Living installations, excuse me. So, kind of along the lines of colonial Williamsburg, although the people don't seem to interact with the people in the installation don't seem to interact with the people watching it.
With the observers. Yeah, the idea is that she curates these exhibits where you have live people enacting cultural rituals from various time periods. So it feels real. So rather than looking at the artifacts, you're experiencing, being part of that culture.
Right. So she's invited to Belarus, to a small town. I don't remember the name, but someone wants to have a living installation of what Jewish life was like. Someone found out that he actually has Jewish heritage, and so he's interested in knowing what Jewish life was like for his grandparents or great-grandparents.
Yeah. I mean, he's a Belarusian tycoon. He has a lot of money. And as you mentioned, he realizes that he knows that way back he has a Jewish ancestor. And this has made him very curious about Judaism and Jewish observance and Jewish people. And so he reaches out to her with this proposal that she put on a living installation, but with a catch that it's going to not just be a few rituals and not just be you come to the museum and go home, but it's going to be 24/7 basically, so that people come in, watch this family, a Jewish family, enacting life as it would have been 150 years ago, and they're like observing them as if it's reality. That's his proposal.
Which is a kind of bizarre one. But she goes along with it. She's intrigued by the idea, and she contacts some distant cousins of hers who are observant Jews living in Israel, and they agree to come and be the family that is living in this installation, in this cabin. The son is preparing for his bar mitzvah, so they'll see him studying.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the daughter and the mother spend most of their time cooking and cleaning.
As Jewish women once did, and maybe still do.
So, and Jennifer ends up bringing her own teenage daughter, whose summer plans fell through, to kind of keep her away from a not so good influence. And Jennifer is rather proud of raising her daughter in an atheist environment. She's Jewish, she identifies as Jewish, but they do nothing that is Jewish. So this is all a research project for her as well, trying to figure out what are the Jewish customs of people who would have lived then. And she also brings along a journal to use as a prop in this installation, the Neuer Jiddischer Horizon,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that we will later learn has this poem by their ancestor in it. But she doesn't read Hebrew, she doesn't read Yiddish. It's just basically a prop to her of something that she's had sitting around the house. But then her cousin recognizes it, that their family had this also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I wanted some sort of object that was going to be passed from generation to generation in some way. And that object is actually a Yiddish poem written by the original ancestor from 1850, which neither of these two modern people, not the American, not the Israeli, even know. And they can't know her. And I just thought it's really interesting the way objects move from generation to generation, from place to place. But I think there was also sort of the idea of the larger idea of language and what happens to language, because of course it's in Yiddish, and we all know what happened to the Yiddish speakers. There are very few of them now. And just this whole idea of the language that both of their ancestors once spoke not that long ago has been practically obliterated, so that their descendants can't read it, can't understand it. I just thought that was interesting. So yeah, I don't know. As you say, it appears in each story.
Right. And that comes up in the next chapter that I want to talk about. But another thing that happens is that Jennifer's daughter gets to know these cousins, and she's intrigued by the Jewish observance that she's never known, and starts participating in the installation as well, much to her mother's dismay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this book was written before October 7th. And I think that all of our concerns were very different. There's before and there's after. And in the time when I was writing it, I was thinking about more of the subject of like alienation and alienation from our roots, whether it's cultural or religious, and how many American Jews today, not everybody, obviously, and it varies, but there are many who are kind of alienated from those roots. And yet, when given an opportunity to make that connection, it can be so intriguing and such an amazing experience in a way to reconnect with what has been lost. And in that story, this teenage girl who I mean, she's half Asian, she's the product of intermarriage, and still there's room for her to look back and to relate to her Jewish ancestors on the level of enacting Judaism in a way. So like the chapter is called Reality. And I think the whole time you can sort of wonder, well, where does this living installation stop being an exhibit and start being real life? And I think that kind of that move sort of demonstrates how this teenage girl moves from the feeling that this is just an exhibit and it's fake to an actual experience, which is reality for her.
So the next chapter jumps back, quite a ways to 1968 in Tel Aviv, where it's another cousin meetup.
Well, their mothers, interestingly enough, right? Jennifer's mother and Nadav's mother, who are, I guess, third cousins. Yeah. Yeah, they meet up in that chapter, of course, which is 40, 50 years earlier than the previous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the cousin Nancy is coming from the United States in 1968 to visit Yardena and her husband Emil.
Mm-hmm.
And Nancy is full blown hippie, peacenik, anti war, loud, brash, says what's ever on her mind, dresses in, bright clothing. And Yardena and her husband are kind of serious, sensible people. They enjoy intellectual discussions, and they're really taken aback by this younger cousin. And they've also, this is in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. So, they just can't comprehend that there's a total lack of understanding between them about the feelings about war. So Nancy is protesting the Vietnam War, a war somewhere far away that United States is getting involved in someone else's business, while Yardena and Emil are living in a country which has been attacked. So obviously they have very different ideas of what the correct response is.
I mean, I think that chapter shows a real contrast of where the lives of American Jews and the lives of Israeli Jews started to go off in very different directions. One of the ways that I sort of think about this book is with the analogy of a tree. So with the tree, you see what's on the surface, but beneath the surface is this very deep and sometimes very complicated network of roots, which is feeding the tree. So what's happening in the book is the roots are the tree's getting further and further away from those roots, and you see that in the 1968 chapter, which is, I mean, these are people whose grandparents were first cousins, and yet these grandchildren have turned out to be, just completely different and living not just different in personality, but living in very different realities, and their Jewish identity is completely different. And it's just, I think it's, I moved to Israel 40 years ago from Canada, and I am always experiencing this sort of very, very interesting sort of give and take relationship between the Jews abroad and Jews in Israel. And as I said, I think it's changed a lot after October 7th. I think there's been a real sea change, which is going to continue to evolve. But that would be a chapter that I didn't write.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long chain, and that's a link in the chain going back.
Obviously, Yardena and Emil are Hebrew speakers,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't speak Yiddish at all. And Yardena's mother did not speak Yiddish at all. And when Yardena's mother arrived in Israel, she said, "That's it. I'm starting a new life in the Jewish homeland. I'm speaking Hebrew." And she had that copy of the journal, the Yiddish journal, and she donated it to a little Yiddish library. And Nancy is just shocked that they're not keeping hold of not only this precious item, but the language and the culture, that you could just separate yourself like that. And at first, Yardena is like, we're a new people, we're reinventing ourselves. But then Yardena says, but looking at Nancy's puzzled expression, she muses for the first time that perhaps it is a little odd, such a total negation of one's mother tongue and the time when one spoke it.
Well, yes. I mean, that's absolutely historical. It's well known that the pioneers and the Zionists who settled Israel in the early days basically outlawed Yiddish. The whole idea was to create a, quote, new Jew who spoke Hebrew. And Yiddish was a language that belonged to the diaspora. And along with that language came a lot of baggage, which they didn't want. They absolutely wanted to separate themselves from. And it's true that it was really forbidden almost to speak Yiddish in some social circles, and particularly in the kibbutzim, particularly where they were living a life that was very ideological. That we are going to be new Jews, and we're going to live completely differently than the lives that we left in Eastern Europe, and that involves just cutting ties with Yiddish. So yeah, I mean, I didn't make that up. That's that's a historical reality, and the result.
I believe you.
Yeah.
But it was just interesting that Yardena was able to step back from that and say, oh, maybe that is a little weird.
Well, yeah, I mean,
That that had been the accepted thing, that that's what everyone did. We're about reinvention. And then,
I think that, there's many Israelis here who, already have two, three, four generations in Israel at this point. And I think that, Zionism has evolved and the children of those, first, those pioneers that first came, there's always a reevaluation of things that once seemed essential. And I guess that sort of hints in that direction where you can sort of re-examine, return and re-examine that decision and say, okay, what was gained, but what was lost? I mean, I don't think that there are a lot of Israelis who regret that we don't speak Yiddish in Israel or that it's not a very dominant language here. But there you go. I mean, it's a fact. And as I said, it's the idea of totally abandoning a language is pretty, it's monumental, really.
in the United States, in the past decade, maybe a little more, there's been a resurgence of interest in
Mhm.
Yiddish. And there's academic programs, and people are starting to write again in Yiddish and to, rediscover older works. So, is there not a similar movement in Israel?
I would say less so. There might be individuals, and there's definitely Yiddish courses in various places for whoever wants, but I don't think it's like a trend. No, no, I wouldn't say that.
It's interesting.
It is. It is.
Okay, so let's step back in time a little bit more. So, now we're in 1946, and Yardena's mother, Tamar, is engulfed in kibbutz life with her husband Shimon, and she's trying to get relatives to join her, and she ends up involved with another man, Otto or Avner, in forgot to make a note. Which underground movement were they?
I actually don't think I mentioned maybe the Haganah, I guess. Yeah, probably the Haganah or the Pamach. Yeah.
So she gets involved in this underground movement, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an amazing period of Israeli history, those pre-war years in which that story plays out. For one thing, there was no state of Israel yet, and it wasn't a sure thing that there would be until it actually happened. In the years leading up, it was the opposite. The community was under a very real threat of Nazi invasion. And nobody knew how the war was going to evolve or turn out. And there was actually in 1941-42, with the Nazis fighting in North Africa, there was a very real threat that they could come into Israel and do what they were doing in Eastern Europe. So at the time, we know obviously that there were underground movements working against the British with, they were different ideologically. Some supported a more violent confrontation, others didn't want to have a confrontation with the British, but they realized that they needed to develop some sort of proto-army, and they needed weapons, and they needed to train people. And they were right, because in 1948, a few years after the story takes place, of course, was the War of Independence, and the ones who actually had to defend the Jewish communities in Israel were these underground groups with these weapons, which were illegal at the time. Yeah, so it's a piece of history, and I kind of wanted to capture it. I think today Israel looks pretty strong and pretty solid, and even now, it's not under an existential threat, but at the time before the state was created, that wasn't the case. And I think it's important to remember that. I think that many people today aren't quite aware of the struggles involved in creating the country, working towards independence. And but it's such an interesting moment, because as I said, these are descendants of people who came from these little impoverished shtetls, and they had no background in defense or state building or institution building. It was all done over a short few years by some very, very devoted and dedicated people. And that's why we have the state of Israel today, thanks to them.
All right. Well, let's skip back to Vilna in 1939, where Gavril, who's Tamar's cousin, is a teacher, and Tamar, well, not again, but since we're going back in time, but is writing all her cousins saying, please come to Israel. I see what's going on in Europe. You need to get out of there. Come here.
Yeah, it was Palestine at the time.
They get her letters and just laugh it off. Ah, that's Tamar again.
Well, listen, I mean, it's easy to in retrospect to say, just go, do what she's saying. But I was really trying in that story to get into the mindset of somebody living in Eastern Europe in 1939. And of course, nobody knew what was coming, even with the threat of the Nazis, even seeing the anti-Semitism in Germany and hearing Hitler's speeches. Nobody would have ever predicted what was going to happen. And I think that's what interested me, to get into that mindset. There's so many novels coming out, about the Holocaust and from so many different aspects, and those books are really important. But what I was after was the mindset of the community before that happened. And it's an ironic story because the chapter is called Tragedy. But if you read the story, it's not just the tragedy of what we know will happen to Gabriel and his family. There's other tragedies there, which are not, it's on many levels. It's tragic on many levels. And the Holocaust is only one of those.
One of them is that Gabriel meets a brilliant young writer, and he really wants to encourage this young man and ends up visiting him and seeing just the absolute abject poverty that he's living in. Everyone's poor, but he's the poorest of the poor, and supporting a sick mother and younger siblings, and he just can't devote time to writing. He has to support this family.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the tragedies.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah. I mean, I think I was hinting at that also, because in the book, at the time of the story, Gabriel and everyone there don't know they're going to be the subject of a tremendous tragedy, and he's thinks that the fact that this young man is not going to be able to realize his potential is a tragedy. One of the things that really struck me in my research was just how often, writers living at the time and afterwards would talk about the poverty of Jews, just in economic terms. There were so many poor people in those communities. The economies of Poland, of Lithuania at the time were in terrible shape. The situation after the First World War in those countries, it just ravaged them and ravaged their economies, and they could not keep up with Western Europe. And it was very, very hard to find work, and it was hard to find work that paid a decent wage, and poverty was rampant. And so that's also, I think, a historical fact that, we've lost touch with that. I mean, if you think that story plays out in 1939, well, that wasn't even 100 years ago. It wasn't that long ago
Mm-hmm.
that our ancestors, our descendants, our families were living in terrible conditions. And that's why, of course, many of them left
Right,
to
of
find
course.
prosperity in America.
Yeah, so then you go just 1 year further back to Chicago in 1938, where Nate
Nat, yeah.
is, an up and coming young man. He's educated. His mother is still barely speaks English. She speaks Yiddish. She's very old school, and he's trying to be very American. He's dating a very assimilated woman named Sally, who's, again, very modern and very disdainful of those old world Jews who've been coming in. Her family came over, years before in the wave of German immigration. And so he's dating her, knowing that, but he doesn't want her to meet his mother, knowing that there will be a conflict. So when his mother gets theater tickets to the Yiddish theater, he kind of flips out, and instead of taking his girlfriend Sally, he takes Frida, who's a young woman who works in his office, who's also a new immigrant with Polish-German background. And she and the mother instantly connect. They love the theater production of the Dybbuk. They laugh, they cry together. So it's very much about the different waves of immigration and how they connect, or rather don't connect.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that story you see the tension around the whole idea of immigration and trying to assimilate into American society, which is something, I mean, I read a lot in my research about, immigrant stories and how hard these immigrants from Eastern Europe worked to become American, speak English, blend into society, and in many cases lose a lot of their Jewishness, whatever that meant. And I think that now we're sort of at the level of, say, our grandparents, our great grandparents, and the things they went through. And I think that's where you feel reverberations up to our day, especially now. That was also interesting because I think, again, before October 7th, American Jews felt entirely assimilated. The whole question of, like, are Jews white was it was a question because that's the extent to which Jews were considered just total mainstream America. But it wasn't always like that, and there was definitely a generation of that had to adjust and pay the price and live as immigrants, and society was not, maybe in some ways, less kind than it is today, about, in terms of difference, in terms of hierarchies, in terms of accepting people from other cultures. It was kind of brutal, and everybody just struggled to become American, to assimilate.
So we'll skip back another 40, 45 years in separation to Propoysk, Belarus, where we meet Yoina, who's the son of one of the three brothers, the triplets, who had been separated. And one of the brothers, Itzik, wants a reunion of the brothers, and for each of them to bring the little scrap of paper that their mother had written the poem on. She'd given each of them one verse. And Yoina's father is too ill to travel, so he sends Yoina to Vilna to meet his two uncles and cousins and to reunite the poems together. So it's interesting because your chapter is called Separation, but it's about the reunion of the family.
Yeah, were you wondering about that?
A little bit.
Well, actually, there's something else going on in that chapter. In terms of the actual story, you have this young man recently married in an arranged marriage, and he doesn't know very much about the wider world outside of his shtetl of Propoysk. And for the first time, he takes a journey to the big city of Minsk. That's the big city. And he's exposed to the wider world, and he's religious, he's very observant. He's lived a life, which is around the synagogue and a little bit of Torah and Talmud study. And all of a sudden he's exposed to, as I said, life in the larger world. And Yona has a secret that he keeps from his parents. And the secret is that he reads the secular Jewish newspapers, which they would be very upset about. And the whole idea about the separation is it's the beginning of a process which many Jewish families underwent, which involved leaving the orthodoxy, or leaving a life based on and rooted in religion, and starting to think about assimilating into the wider world in various ways. Yeah, and then there's other aspects of separation in the story as well.
Okay, makes sense. And then finally, the last chapter, Three Fathers, we meet Razel in 1850, again in Proposk, Belarus, who has three sons and has terrible choices to make. And we finally learn about how and why the brothers get separated. So I'm going to let you talk about this chapter so I don't get into the spoiler territory.
So yeah, I mean, this is sort of the ground zero of the story. You have a young mother who has triplets, little boys, 8 years old. And at the time in Russia, another historical fact, every Jewish community had to fulfill a quota of boys to send to the Russian army for a period of 25 years. And this went on, I'm not sure if it's 50 or 40 or 30 years, for a very long period of time. Every year, the community would have to hand over a certain amount of boys, and the minimum legal age for this was 12-year-olds. But when a community had difficulty getting enough boys together to fill the quota, they would look at younger boys. So that in this story, there's a very real risk to these three boys that one or two of them will be drafted against everybody's will. And it's intolerable, obviously. As intolerable as it sounds, it was a reality. And people have told me since that this happened in their families, even though it's been, as I say, decades and decades. But the memory of it, it was absolute trauma. So that's what she's contending with. And she has to figure out a way to prevent this terrible fate.
And there are generally two ways to avoid it. One is to bribe the man in charge of collecting the kids, but she has no resources to do that. And the other is if you only have one son,
Yeah, yeah,
they won't take the last son.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, these are the guidelines. And yeah, so that's what she has to work with. And the story develops from there, because what you have are these three boys grow up to, father these families in which each one goes ultimately in a different direction. One family, as as is clear from what we've been talking about, goes to America. One goes to Israel, to Palestine, and the other perishes in the Shoah. And I think that this story is extremely typical of anyone with Eastern European descent.
Mm-hmm.
Any family will have all three of these things happening in their family in the past 150 years.
Absolutely.
Almost a prototype. So, but I thought it would be interesting to look at this story, in fiction, with fictional characters, where I could sort of shape the destinies and the connections and the themes. And also just for the reader to be able to hold these stories in their head at once, so that they can see a line stretching from today back to Eastern Europe, when everything we know about our lives today had not yet happened.
Right.
But that's where we come from.
So, why did you decide to tell the story kind of backwards, going backward in time?
So yeah, I mean, that sort of relates back to this tree analogy, where I start with what you can see today. And when you read the story of Jennifer, it's true, it's a little bit weird in a way. I mean, I think I was aiming for something that's a little edgy, a little indicative of our times, where technology and postmodernism and art installations, which are very cutting edge, are part of our lives. But basically, I think that Jennifer and her husband and her daughter are very recognizable people for us. But as you go back in time, the characters become less people we can identify with. So that I think even by the time that you're around the three Holocaust era stories, they're in very different times. They have very different consciousness. Their worlds are very, very different from ours. I wanted to take the reader back to those worlds, to put them in those worlds with this idea of starting from what we know and we can see and it's familiar, and then moving back to things that we have lost touch with and we can no longer access or barely access. So that was how I designed it.
So, working in so many different places and time periods, it seems like that must have been a massive amount of research.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Each chapter was like writing a new book, new characters, new place, new issues. And to help me, I like to read literature of the period. So in the back of the book, there's a list of all kinds of sources I used to sort of help get me into the mindset of the people in each particular time. And interestingly, one of the time periods that was very hard for me to research was the Vilna story, because there is stuff out there where you can see maybe how religious people lived, but there isn't that much about secular families. And Gabriel's family is, obviously they're still very Jewish and they're very connected, but they're not living an Orthodox lifestyle. And it was hard to sort of find sources or even stories that depict that kind of life. I mean, there are, you can find it. Um, and a good example is Basheva Singer, who wrote both about secular Jews in Poland and religious Jews in Poland. He knew both sides quite well, but it wasn't easy to find.
Right. Well, glad you were able to find something. So, do you have anything you would like to talk about on your book that I haven't thought to ask about?
Well, I think, again, in the wake of October 7th, what has surprised me a little bit is I feel there's a renewed interest among many people regarding questions about their Jewish identity, about the roots of their Jewish families, and also I think for especially for younger people, questions about Israel and why Jews even live there. What are we doing here? How did we get here? Who are these crazy people who decided to live here? And why did anybody even think it was necessary? Because, like, if their ancestors went to America and it worked out more or less, why would anyone go to Israel? For what? So I think that the book kind of sheds some light on those questions in a way that might be interesting for people who never really thought about it or were sort of disconnected from the whole idea of Israel and why, what it means in the life of Jewish people, in the history of Jewish people. I think it kind of, again, through fiction, which I think is a really interesting way of showing people things. It's not a lecture, it's not an essay, it's a story. And you can read it as just a story, but I think it can work on you in really interesting ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Give you a jumping off point for lots of different discussions. So I know that there were a lot of Jewish literary journals at the time, and still, but was the one you mentioned an actual journal?
No, no, I made it up.
Okay. I know that your first novel, The Wayward Moon, will be reissued this year with Toby Press, which is very exciting. But I was wondering if you have any new projects in the works that you would like to talk about.
Well, I'll mention that I know what it is to put out a novel with a small press. It's very, very difficult. Anyone who writes knows this. And in order to sort of help the community, I have a small website where I review Jewish literature that has come out with small presses. And I often invite another writer to also review a work of Jewish literature. It's called Reading Jewish Fiction. I've been doing it for a few years now. So that's like a pet project.
I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Well, if someone were to use your book as a call to action for tikkun olam, or something not based on your book, something for repairing the world, what would it be?
Well, this might sound a little funny. I guess you get all kinds of interesting responses. But I think that it's really important for people to support Jewish literature and for not only Jewish people, but especially for Jewish people to read books that are coming out on Jewish themes, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or poetry, and use that as a way of engaging with what's happening in our Jewish community worldwide at the moment. So I would encourage them to try to read books on Jewish themes and make a point of doing that. And then supporting the authors, whether it's, buying the books, whether it's writing reviews in places where people will see that, whether it's, passing the books on to friends, recommending them. It's a small thing, but culture is culture. And if we don't keep it up, it just won't exist.
Absolutely.
So we all have a part to play in that.
Right. Well, Janice Weizman, thank you so much for speaking to me about your book, Our Little Secrets. I really enjoyed our talk.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me. It's been fun.
If you are interested in any of the books we discussed today, you can find them at your favorite Board and Brick or online bookstore or at your local library. Thanks to Dianki for use of his Freilich, which definitely makes me happy. This podcast is a project of the Association of Jewish Libraries, and you can find more about it at www.jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks. I would like to thank AJL and my podcast mentor, Heidi Rabinowitz. Keep listening for the promo for her latest episode.
Hi everyone, I'm Martin Lemmelman, the author and illustrator of The Miracle Seed. I'm thrilled to be able to join Heidi in the upcoming Book of Life podcast. I'd like to dedicate my episode to two amazing Israeli women, Dr. Sarah Salon of Hadassah Hospital and Dr. Elaine Salaway of the Araba Institute. They created the miracle in my book. For more than 1,000 years, the Judean date palm was extinct. Working with ancient seeds discovered on the fortress of Masada, they brought this special tree back to life.
The Book of Life is the sister podcast of Nice Jewish Books. I'm your host, Heidi Rabinowitz, and I podcast about Jewish Kidlit. Join me to hear my conversation with Martin Lemmelman about The Miracle Seed at bookoflifepodcast.com.